Hi everyone, just going to try and make a brief video on how to set up the Pro Mazda. I notice there's a lot of questions in the forum about people not really understanding what parameters to touch in this car. So to start with, the area I'd start if you don't already have a setup to base it on is using the iRacing setups. Now these setups, they're not going to be the absolute quickest, but they're a really good place to start from. And I find they're actually quite competitive. Around most tracks they'll be within a few tenths of the peak pace, assuming you pick the right one. Now of course the downforce will depend on the track. The more downforce you run, the less straight line speed you have. So on a track with a lot of straights, you want lower downforce. On kind of like a mixed straights and corners, you want medium. And high downforce in this car should be reserved for tracks that have very few straights and a lot of medium to high speed corners that need the downforce. Medium, something like Suzuka, which although it seems like it has a lot of corners, also has quite long runs between the corners of full throttle. Like anything in this car that can be deemed as long periods of full throttle is a straight. Basically not a straight, it's just when you lift the throttle. Watkins Glen is of course a low downforce track because it's got long straights, really long straights. I'll just start with the default setup and see where we go. Now these default setups, they're rather safe. They're built to, give people who don't want to control a car maybe on the absolute ragged edge, something they can race with. And realistically, if you're 2 or 3 seconds off the pace, I actually think you can find more time focusing on yourself. These setup changes, from the default setups at least, are only really ever about the last few tenths. So I can already see there that when I go to turn into that corner, the front's not moving into the apex as nicely as I'd like. I'm kind of having to come off the throttle for much too long, which is only going to hurt your lap time. In this car, it's basically about getting as much turn as you can while the rear stays planted. You don't want the rear constantly moving around, but you don't want the corners to go on for longer than they have to. And the more corner speed you can carry into and through a corner, the shorter the corner will be, and therefore the shorter your lap time will be. Yeah, it's not really going where I'd like it to that much, but it's not a bad setup. It's actually quite controllable. Let's see how it goes now I've got the tyres up to temp. Yeah, pushing out far too wide on throttle. But none of this is any huge revelation, this is to be expected. The iRacing setups are always set up with understeer in mind. So I'll start turning in a little bit early to try and combat that, and turning on the brakes. Actually not a bad lap time at all, even though I haven't had any warm up today. This is the default setup. Try and keep it a bit tighter through the first corner. That gave me a bit of run out. This default setup might actually make a little bit of a fool out of me because the 3 laps, that's really quite a good time in this car. Default weather. Okay, so pretty much as expected, very competitive setup as the default setups usually are, but I still am feeling a little bit understeering, I think, compared to how optimal the setup could be. There's definitely a little bit of time in that still. So the low downforce feels about right. So this is where you've got to make the decisions after you've done a preliminary run, what more you want out of the car. The first thing I look at would probably be the aero balance. I actually think, well, actually the first thing we'll look at would be the tyres. In the Pro Mazda, I prefer the lower tyre pressures. Typically they say that higher pressures, 20-21 psi, will give the car better high speed grip because the tyre deforms less under load. But lower pressures, because the tyre sags a bit more at the bottom, will give it better low speed grip. This is a higher contact patch. Now a lot of people adjust the tyres per the weather, but I don't tend to ever do it. I just tend to leave it at one tyre pressure all the time. And in the Mazda, I've typically found it likes lower pressures a bit more, just to give it a bit more mechanical grip. It has plenty of aero to keep it through the high speed stuff. Now, when adjusting the aero front to rear, you need to remember that when it's kind of like it is a balance. If you leave the rear amount of downforce the same, you add more to the front, you're effectively taking grip off the rear of the car as it's pushing the nose down more. And the same with the rear. If you add more rear wing, you're taking grip off the front of the car as it's pushing the back end more. You have to get that balance between front and rear right. So the impression I got when taking the car out for a drive is that the front was lacking a bit of grip relative to what it could do. So what my options would be is to add more front wing or to remove rear wing to fix the balance. Now, of course, adding more wing will add more drag, which could be not beneficial at this track. I find when looking at the downforce, you want to look at this, look at the balance here. Now, this isn't actually accurate unless you set the ride heights correctly, but I never bother doing that because to me it's just about keeping that number the same. Like if you want a 43% front balance, but you want to add more total downforce, then you just add more wing at the front and the rear to keep the number the same. And as long as that's not changing, then it's fine. So to me, I find the absolute lowest you ever want to run this car on front downforce is 42. Basically, the Pro Mazda gets most of its speed from how much grip you can get at the front of the car. It's not a very powerful car, so therefore the back of the car doesn't need a lot of grip. So you're basically just adding more front downforce to get it through the corners quicker. And the more speed you can carry through the corners, the quicker lap times are going to be. Now 42's, it's not too bad. Like a really understeery setup will have 41, but I think I can push it a bit further. I'll just try adding a touch more front and taking off some rear. 43. Okay. Now, I'm no engineer, so most of what I'm saying here is just based on experience. The front any roll bars, like the downforce, the softer they are, the more grip you have. So if you reduce the ARB plates, you're adding more grip to the front of the car. Now, that would of course be useful to getting it to turn more. I typically find that in high speed stuff, aero is more important, aero balance. In low speed stuff, you want to do more with the mechanical grip, which is the anti-roll bars and the dampers. So toe in, I nearly always leave at -2. Not really sure the explanation why. I find that gives the car a decent amount of turn. My understanding of it is the more negative toe you give the front, the more the car will turn. But I find that -2 is just a setting that works in most situations. Now, this area of the car gets a little bit more difficult. The ride height, based on both the spring perch offset and the spring rate, the lower the spring rate, the lower the ride height effectively. Now, the logic behind the spring rate is the higher the spring rate, the more aero grip you're going to have as the car doesn't deform under load as much. It keeps the springs fairly stiff, whereas the lower the spring rate, the more mechanical grip you're going to have as the car's softer to the road. But you also use it kind of in like a total manipulation of ride height and spring rate, as you can't always get this car down to the lowest possible ride height by using just this. See, the ride height won't go down to the lowest amount. Better do both sides as that brings it down. You could take another, I don't know, it would go down to 0.70, I believe, before it starts to bottom out. And to do that, you're going to need to take some spring rate too if you want that front to be really low. Yeah, so that's about as 0.79. That's about as low as it will go actually. So that's with the spring rate at the lowest and with the spring perch offset at the lowest and the spring rate down. So I don't really particularly want low spring rates down here, so I'll just leave it high because there's quite a lot of fast corners around this track. So I want the springs to actually support the load a bit better. Now the ARB rocker hole, it's much like the front ARB diameter. If you put it soft, put it slow, you get more front grip out of the car. And if you put it fast, you get less front grip out of the car. The camber, again, like the toe, I just tend to leave it. I find 2.8 is quite competitive. The more negative camber you give the car on the front, the more it will turn, but also the less it will brake. So if you start to go too aggressive with it, you'll find the fronts are locking up quite constantly. The caster, again, I don't really touch it. 7's quite good for this car. Yeah, I find adding a lot of caster to the car actually adds quite a lot of drag. If you put it up to 8, 8.5, then you get the wheel feels rather tight and it sort of responds more nicely to turns. But I just find on a track like this, the suspension can actually have quite a decent drag increase, which is why you would maybe consider reducing the camber, but I'm not going to do it just initially. I'll think about that later. Now, another important thing to think about when driving the car is the front to rear ride height, otherwise known as the rake. So the more aggressive the rake, which is the lower the front compared to the higher the rear, sort of the more front end the car will have in aero. the actual aero balance depends on the rake of the car. So I'm not entirely sure the actual aerodynamics behind this, but I assume it's because the underbody of the car acts as kind of like a wing structure in of itself. But also, the higher the rear, the lower the front, the more you're pushing the front wing down to closest to the road, and therefore the better seal and downforce you're getting from it. So if you've kind of pushed the wing settings as much as you want to, if you put the back of the car up and put the front of the car down, it'll give you more turn. But then it actually starts to throw out your front downforce amount, because this front downforce amount is relative to the rake on the car. So if you have left the rake the same and you're changing the front downforce amount using these settings, and then you start messing around with the rake of the car, then you could be in for quite a trouble, because you're adding either more front or less front than what you expected based on that aero calculator. The spring rate on the rear is the same. They seem to like to put the fronts a lot higher than the rears in these setups, which I'm not really sure I think is the good way to go. It depends on the track. Like, you actually want a fair bit more front grip around a track like this, whereas at something like Mid-Ohio, I'd run them all fairly soft. Like at Mid-Ohio, I'd run 600 in all corners, because you want the car to have a lot of low-speed mechanical grip. But because most of the corners here are high-speed and flowing, giving it good aero grip with the high spring rates could actually be quite useful. The ARB rocker holes at the rear is the same. If you want more understeer, you go slow. More oversteer, you go fast. Because if it's slow, you're putting grip on the rear of the car, which means you're taking the balance away from the front of the car. If it's fast, you're putting less grip on the rear of the car, then putting more to the front of the car. The camber on the rear, I will usually just leave it 0.1, 0.5. If you want to take a bit of drag off the car, you can reduce it, but I find it aids the car's turn to leave it at that. Another option would be 1.2, but I never really go very aggressive with the rear camber. The stock settings are quite good. Fuel level 2, obviously, toe in, +1 toe on the rear is fine. It's fine for pretty much every setup. I'd very rarely change that. If you put in more positive toe on the rear, you tend to get the impression that the car's sort of moving from the back of the car and sort of turning from the rear, which I don't like going into a corner. Some people like it. ARB preload should never be anything 0.0 but 0.0. If this is something like negative or positive something, then your setups aren't the same. If you have different setups left to right of the car, the ARB preload goes away from 0.0 because you've got more cross rate, and it does that to balance it out. You don't really want to run asymmetrical settings. Some tracks I've heard people say that it can be a benefit, but for me, no. I've never done it intentionally. These damper settings, it's much the same as the anti-roll bars. Softer at the front and harder at the rear, which means more negative on the front and more positive on the rear will give you more front grip. I find the stock setups are quite good. They're the last thing I tinker with if you don't get the balance you want. Okay, so the goal of what I've done in there is to give the car a bit more turn. The only problem with giving the car a bit more turn at times is that you go in and you find you've actually made the car a lot worse. Like I could probably run a 40.7, maybe 0.6 with that default setup, which is quite competitive. So to make all these changes, we're hoping to actually feel the car going through the corners, carrying more speed. Also, another tip: don't judge the car on the outlap. The tyres aren't under pressure yet. Tyres aren't under pressure yet, so would expect to have lost straight line speed, I've added more front wing and I've added more brake, so the car's going to have more drag on it. Doesn't look to be a huge amount of difference though. So I can definitely feel I've got more front end, which is enabling me to run tight lines. Not a bad first lap. How I'm getting more straight line speed, I'm not quite sure. We should have less.
About 5 laps of fuel left.
Key to the slack is getting turn 1 right. If you don't get that turn 1 right, you're pretty much chasing the time for the rest of the lap. And once you get that T1 right, the rest of the lap will fall into place a bit better. Back end of the car is kind of coming up now because I've moved it to a more oversteery setup. It's kind of sliding a little bit at the back and the middle. down a gear through that. So running a few laps with the setup changes we made, I've kind of turned a car that I'm having to get off the throttle and wait in the middle of the corner to one that's turning very nicely through the apex in the corner. But the back end is wanting to let go if I give it too much lock. So what I'm having to do is knock down shift and unsettle the car and just use that momentum through the apex. Still not really wanting to get into the apex through that long right-hander through that, which is part drive, but also the setup's still a bit loose without the steering.
You got about 2 laps of fuel left.
So overall, I'd recommend everyone to start building their setups from scratch if at all possible, using the iRacing default ones. It teaches you a lot about what you actually want out of the car yourself. And while other people's setups are great and they really can help both teach you and be fast, it really is important to understand why you actually want to make certain setup decisions. Let me take 2 gears down there that time. So overall, I'd say these setup changes have made the car quicker. What I'm feeling out there now is that the back's still just a tiny bit reluctant around some corners. Maybe if I softened up the springs a little bit, I could just get it a tiny bit of rear grip without compromising the car as a whole. But what you might find then is you just add more understeer to the car. that is the nature of the setup compromise. You kind of find what works well as a system. It's not, there is no one easy fix. Definitely still a little bit from driver in there. I didn't really put together my best sectors, but I'd say overall that's actually quite a decent setup now. That's something you could go out and race and be very competitive with. Thanks for watching this guide, everyone. Hope people found it useful. Let me know if you have any questions.